Welcome to Understanding Wyrd in Your Life, and happy solstice to you all. And it's good to have you all on today. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm the author of The Way of Fire and Ice, which I have right here, and is probably looking backwards at the moment to me. And the upcoming sequel, Spinning Wyrd, which is something we're going to get a bit more into today, as far as some of the stuff that I'm going to get into. As sort of a very brief little thing about me before we go off to the races here. I've been a practicing heathen for, like, I'm having to do math, at least 15 years, and have been doing paganism of some kind or another for even longer than that. I'm sure for a lot of the millennial and Zoomer folks that are in the audience, the phrase "I started on my own with books and the internet when I was a teenager" is probably a pretty familiar one. Um, so I've been, as I said, I've been practicing for somewhere around 15 years in particularly inclusive and anti-racist forms of heathen practice, which is to say pagan spirituality that is derived from and inspired by the Nordic peoples from before and during the process of Christian conversion. So that's talking, Odin, Thor, and all of that. But what we're going to get into today is something that I think is even more important than those gods. Because often I find that when folks are coming to pagan practice, the first thing that jumps out, understandably, is you all have many gods, and it involves worshiping these many different gods of myth and lore. But I find there's more to it than that. And particularly when you're talking in the Nordic and heathen context, there are much bigger forces at work that shape everything, including the gods. And one of those, which is a significant subject in the next book that I've got in Spinning Wyrd, is Wyrd, which is one way of saying fate. It's directly derived from the word Urd, which is the Old Norse word for more or less translated as that which is. And brings with it a whole idea of how we live in the world and how we can have influence and impact on the world around us. So before I dive right in, what I would like to do for everyone to do just for a moment, and this is a thing that we do in Fire and Ice Heathen practice as a way of just getting things to a nice equilibrium and ground it out before doing any big work, is I would like everyone just to briefly close your eyes for a moment and then begin by breathing in through your nose to the count of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And now hold 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And now I'm going to take it away with a little bit of a slideshow. And there it is. Alrighty. So I'm going to kick it off with what is Wyrd. And what we have here in the slide is a bind rune that is referred to as the Web of Wyrd, which represents Wyrd in sort of as a nice, easy image. And it also gives a sense of what it is that we're getting into and talking about. Now, Wyrd, as I said, is a heathen term that is usually translated to mean fate or something similar. More specifically, at least as I understand it, it is best understood as an endlessly emergent organic order which shapes all of existence and is shaped by all things in existence. So we're already getting into some waters that are suggesting that there's quite a bit that's going on here, and particularly some divergence from how generally we understand some of these words, particularly words like fate. Um, And to get into that a little bit more, I think first it's sort of important to unpack the concept of fate and the idea of fatalism. Now, usually when you're out in the world and in society and you're talking about fate or a concept of fate, as well as how it tends to get used in, like, say, popular culture and lots of other places, fate tends to imply a sense of something that can't be changed, something that was supposed to happen, that was meant to happen, and was a product of some kind of greater design that sometimes there's implications of it being sort of capricious and unpredictable. There's other times when it more has the sense of that you are on this path that's been predetermined for you by some bigger, more important things than you. Um, it can be a very diminishing idea, at least as it tends to be understood in society today. And there's a couple of places where this comes from. And we sort of have to unpack this a little bit before I think we can really get into what Wyrd is. And I've got a couple of handy images to help sum up what these different concepts are um, that influence how modern society thinks and talks about fate. The first, which is at the top, is the Rota Fortuna, which literally means the wheel of fate or the wheel of fortune. And I'm not talking about the game show, I'm talking about something that was much more a thing in medieval and Renaissance Europe, which was borrowed from a similar concept that existed in the Roman world. The Rota Fortuna, as is depicted in the image, is seen as this continuous wheel that is always spinning, and the wheel can take people and it can lift them up. It can also bring them crashing down. And there's nothing really that gives you any means to influence how this goes. The wheel just keeps spinning and it just keeps moving, and we're going to get spun and moved along with it, whether we like it or not. Um, and in medieval art, there's examples of things like a poor person who's down at the bottom, while a rich person is at the top of the wheel as it's beginning to spin. And then sometimes it's used in that period as a way of describing things that are beyond our control, or the sense of things being totally out of our control. Um, and in other times, it gives a sense of, well, sometime that person may get their just dues or something, though usually not because there's some great justice to the universe, but more because fortune and fate are fickle, they're unpredictable, um, and they're just going to do what they will. I think it's also worth mentioning when we're talking about the history of this idea and the context that this is also a time period when one of the primary means of execution that existed in Europe was called being broken on the wheel, which is as gruesome as that sounds. So, this idea of the wheel of fate lifting things up and spinning them around and breaking things wasn't just something that was a nice metaphor for these people. It was something that you could very viscerally see sitting outside the castle walls on any given day. Um, the other big idea that tends to influence how we see fate and how fate is understood in modern society comes from Christianity much more directly, and that is the concept of the will of God. To summarize briefly, because there's whole libraries that have been written about this, and there's all kinds of argument about this that exists within Christian theology. I couldn't hope to do all of it justice. I'm just sort of going to give y'all like the baseball card version. The idea of God's will is that God has preordained some kind of path for everybody, some kind of role that you're supposed to play, some kind of special purpose you have to fulfill to enact God's design in the world. And within Christian theology, those who diverge from God's will tend to have misfortune and suffering and bad things happen to them, while those who stay true to God's will are going to be rewarded for it. They're going to find things come much easier. And that's as long as you're following whatever the path is that God sets for you. Now, figuring that out is a completely different subject, and something that's kind of messy because, God is inscrutable and works in mysterious ways. And then you have all these folks standing around saying, well, I'm the one who knows God's will, and I'm going to tell you what it is and what it's supposed to be. In both cases, regardless of how much you see modern views on this as being influenced by which, you could see it as 50-50, 70-30. Depending on the person you talk to, it'll certainly swing more towards one end or the other. But generally speaking, these are both understandings of the concept of fate that are really disempowering when you think about it. They put you on, like, sort of like a bug on a page. You are at the mercy of greater forces than you, and there's really nothing you can do about these things. God is going to do what God will, and if you don't go along with what God wants, then that's too bad, so sad for you. And the wheel of fortune is just going to spin, and what happens to you on that wheel just is. And I need to unpack all this, like I said before, because Wyrd does not work like this. In fact, it's kind of a bit more like this. For the cheesy Star Wars reference, Wyrd, like I said before, is an endlessly emergent order that is being fed and created and influenced by all things in existence. It changes, it grows, it moves, things develop. It isn't static. It isn't, this is one way that things must go. And also, as we're going to see in a minute, it also doesn't have a single author. It doesn't have someone who's sitting up there going, this person is going to be Jeff Bezos and this person is going to live in a gutter. Why? Because I have unscrutable, like, unknowable reasons for why that must happen. So to break it down a little bit more as to how this works, there are two main components that drive Wyrd. And these are, we're talking at like the biggest meta level. It definitely gets much more complicated the more you dig down. But to give a very broad strokes view, the two things that make up Wyrd are Orlog and Hamenya. Orlog is the Old Norse word that generally refers to that which is, what is in the world. Things like your material conditions, the family you're born into, the society and time that you happen to exist in, and all these other things that make up the world around you. Orlog includes everything from the laws of physics to the laws of Congress to the unofficial laws that we come up with in our different friend groups and cultures and everything that decide everything. And in fact, law is something that's kind of interesting when we talk about Orlog, because linguistically, Orlog does share connections with the Old Norse word logr, which literally means law. And we're going to get a little bit more into why that's really important in a bit. But, for now, put a pin in that because that is going to become important. What all Orlog shares in common is it is the consequence of past actions manifesting in the present. So, for example, the different social systems that we live in now were the products of decisions made by people who, some of them are alive right now and exerting power and influence. Some of them are so dead their bones have rotted to dust, and all that we have left of them is memory of their actions. All of that makes up Orlog, as do the actions we take now and what we do now to shape and change the world. Some Orlog is stronger than other Orlog. Some Orlog is, you could say, more fixed and unmoving than other kinds of Orlog. It certainly would be a lot harder, I think, for folks to figure out a way to defy the laws of gravity than to, say, defy an unjust law by action out in the street or something. But generally speaking, all Orlog can, with enough effort and with the right kind of effort, and sometimes collective effort, be changed. Which brings us to Hamenya. Generally speaking, this word tends to be translated as luck. Though I think luck doesn't quite work, because when you say the word luck, then people start thinking of things like poker and roulette and gambling and fortune and things going well or not going well and whether or not you win the lottery. And that doesn't really work when we're talking about Haminya. Um, Haminya is more your personal capacity to cause change. Like, if we're going to make any cross cultural comparisons, and this is a very rough, sloppy one, and is also why I'm going to bounce back to Star Wars in a second. That it sort of could kind of be like how qi from traditional Chinese medicine and spirituality tends to be represented in pop culture, though, that's not really a good comparison, because there's a lot more to qi than that. Just as there's a lot more to Haminya with that, you could also see Haminya as, to turn back to Star Wars for a minute, like how strong you personally are with the Force. Um, but generally, it refers to all of your capacity to cause change. It's made up of lots of other stuff. Some of it is based on things that you inherit. Indeed, one thing that's consistent in the lore is Haminya is inheritable. It is something that is passed down within family lines, much in the same way that, if you have children, or if you are adopting children, or like taking care of students or something, that your conditions and the conditions of your life are going to shape their lives. And this is something that, is pretty straightforward, I think. And what's critical about this is about the inheritability is you get some that comes from what goes before, because of course we're all constrained by our Orlog, but Haminya, like Orlog, can be changed. You can change your capacity. You can expand your ability and your capabilities in certain areas. Maybe there's certain skills that you have a particular talent for that you especially put effort into and become exceptional at. Or maybe there's something you're really not good at, but through a lot of determination and work, and also good teaching and all that other stuff, you manage to get the knack for it and you figure it out. And maybe there's also some things that for you are just like, yeah, no. That doesn't make sense to me. I can't quite do it. And that's okay. That's all part of your Haminya. That's all part of how you can change it and change within yourself. Um, what's most important about Haminya, though, when we're talking about Haminya and Orlog, is through our Haminya, we cause change in the world. And by doing that, we make new Orlog, or we change Orlog that currently exists. And that's where we get to this idea of everything is co-created, everything is in continuous movement and continuous work. Creation is not static, it is always in motion. And that gets us to the facilitators of this process, or at least some of the more important facilitators beyond us ourselves on the individual level. These are the Norns. Now, folks have probably heard about the Norns. I've seen in the chat there's already references that folks are putting out to the Norns as spinners of fate. Without getting too much in, as far as like some of the linguistics and stuff around there, because the way that they use the word spinning in the sources is both in a similar word to what's used for weaving, as well as for spiders spinning silk. There is suggestion that the image of them specifically as weavers is one that might actually be borrowed from Greek mythology. And what we see specifically that's in the source material is descriptions of them doing things like carving runes into the world tree that then are brought up into the tree, or taking water from the wells to sustain the world tree and pack mud into some different spots around it. But generally speaking, the greater Norns, as I'm referring to them here, Urd, Verdandi, and Skald, are much more concerned with keeping the bigger system going, of keeping the world tree healthy, of setting new possibility into motion. They aren't really depicted in any source material as sitting around going, well, this is going to be the length of this particular person's life, and when they hit the end of this string, that's it. Or taking the time to intervene in any particular individual's life in a direct way. Instead, they're just sort of maintaining everything else. One thing that's actually an interesting contrast between them and, like, say, the Moirai, known as the Fates from Greek mythology, is there's no examples, at least none that I could find or think of any of the other gods interfering in the work of the Norns. There are some instances of Greek gods interceding directly with the Moirai. For example, like one case where Apollo goes and gets them righteously drunk so that he can convince them to spare a particular individual that he especially liked. There's no even suggestion of that happening. Even the biggest rule breakers in mythology, like Odin and Loki, are never shown as approaching the greater Norns. They just do their thing and they keep everything moving. There's also the lesser Norns, which are the little Norns that are attached to every individual, and are said to influence every individual's sort of luck and fortune of deciding whether good things or bad things happen to them. And this is where we're going to get back to that thing I said earlier about law. When we're talking about law in the Norse context, the way that these peoples understood law was it is something that is created by the community collectively. And I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. I will get to them in a little bit. So don't worry, I'll get to them in basically in the order that they've been popping up. But anyway, to get back to the topic of law, law was made collectively. It was made in these big assemblies that were referred to as tings or dings, where everybody came together, and even to varying degrees, enslaved peoples could actually address the tings. Men and women could bring their suits and concerns before the ting. Tings were sort of a combination law court and legislative assembly, all of this wrapped up into one, which is really different from how law works now, as well as how it works for a lot of modern history, where law is a thing that is handed down by some kind of external authority. Like in the United States, for example, we have all this mythology about how great the Constitution is that was made by these great men that were geniuses of their time, and it was handed down to us undeserving people. And this also is something that kind of is tied up in some Christian concepts of law as well. This is totally different from what we're dealing with here, and this becomes important when we're talking about the Norns. Because this stuff is done collectively here, and Orlog has connections linguistically with law, and we know by the process, as we've described already, that this is something that is being continuously made by all beings, then it's safe to say that even the work of the little Norns and the big Norns is part of this bigger context. That it's not your individual Norn is flipping coins to decide whether or not today's going to be a good day or bad day for you, but is potentially working in Congress with other Norns. And the most potent evidence we have for this particular interpretation, and I've got it right here in the slide, is the phrase "to make the Norns weep," which is an expression that shows up in quite a few of the sagas. Now, usually it's pretty much always showing up before something really, really awful is about to happen. Or sometimes it's somebody saying something like, "We will do something that will make the Norns weep," as if knowing what it is we're about to do is going to be terrible. And it often is an expression that precedes like great battles or slaughter. And this was something that was interesting to me when I was doing my research of, well, if these are the beings that determine your fortune, then why would they be put in a position where they're having to weep over the design they are making unfold? And the conclusion that I came to from that is, well, perhaps it's because they don't fully have control over this, that they are not individually going, this is how this individual's life is going to unfold. They're developing this in Congress with other things and in conjunction with other beings, just as everything else is in the world too. And I'm loving the comments that are coming up in the chat, by the way. But that's something that I wanted to touch on there of, this is, again, a concept of fate and the world that is always in motion, always developing. And how this ties in with mysticism is through divination, we can know the design of the weird to an extent. it is not something that's totally unscrutable and unknowable. Like all these divinatory practices, and I've got a one stylized image of a Nordic cirrus here, suggests this is a thing that's discernible, it's knowable, it's not the unknowable will of God. This is cause and effect that can be discerned using a number of different methods. And also, when we're talking magic, you can change Wyrd. And that's generally how, at its most base level, all Nordic and heathen magic works. It's specifically by using your Haminga and your deliberate focused will to change what is unfolding within Wyrd and change possibility itself. And to wrap this up, and then I'll answer a couple questions before we have to go. The things that I think are the biggest takeaways from this, as far as what this means in life, is our actions have enduring consequences, as do the actions of others. Our lives are shaped by the actions of those who went before us, just as our actions are going to shape the lives of those who follow us and those who are around us. And based on these things, we have the agency to make change in the world individually and collectively. The designs of how reality work are not fixed. They're always moving and always in motion. And we can always do something with that. So to jump into the questions, and I'm just going to scroll up real quick because I saw there were a few. And if anyone has a question they especially would like to see answered, please post it in the chat now while I am digging through to find a few that looked really good. So, okay, for one, that was from Kimmy. Is Wyrd used in normal everyday conversation in your tradition? I know within the context of mine, somewhat and to an extent. It's something that is always part of life, whether we're consciously acknowledging it and working with it, or if it's something that, and particularly when we're talking more mystical practice, or if it's something that you're considering more philosophically and more broadly. So, and again, that varies depending on person to person and place to place, but I think at least within fire and ice practice, for us, Wyrd is the most important thing because even the gods are subject to Wyrd. Like there is nothing that can really sort of escape from Wyrd's influence. To move on to then to the question from L. I hope I said that right. Are the greater Norns considered deities, or are they beings, forces that function parallel to but outside of the gods? Within particularly fire and ice practice, they are considered gods, but I will admit we also have a more expansive definition of what counts as a god. We do also include the Jotun as gods because the way we refer to it as god is more of a term of almost like celestial weight class of in terms of these are beings of this level of potency and influence than necessarily, oh, these are the ones who are always good or always bad, stuff like that. I mean, quite frankly, I think that anyone who's saying gods are always good is getting into some somewhat slippery ground, morally speaking, and that gets into some really concerning places. We can just sort of look out at anything happening in the news right now involving Christianity for some great examples of what happens with saying God's equal good. But I would say, yeah, they're kind of broadly fit there, sort of as a sense of weight class in terms of their influence over the world. Um, Now, next from Philip Harrison. My old teacher once said that the patterns of a person's life is more like the grain in a wood slab than a woven cloth. The grain just is, the pattern comes from influences outside of your control. Would that be accurate to your mind? Um, I personally actually kind of lean more towards an image of woven cloth, or for something that you could say is a more even more naturalistic metaphor, you could say something similar to like say the currents and tides within a body of water. Um because in a wood slab, that is a thing that is cut. The tree has been cut and it has been rendered down into lumber. There's nothing that's going to happen with that slab. Whereas what we see in Wyrd pretty consistently is, even though there's the initial patterns that get woven into the design, there still is room to change those patterns. Even the goddess Frigg, who is said to know all things but keep her silence in most things, is depicted as only knowing everything that is or was, and doesn't really have clear knowledge of the future. And existing and examples that we see of that tend to suggest that the future is much more in flux than we think. While in hindsight, things might look like, say, a slab of wood, because it all makes sense from where we're standing. Of course, there were all these causes and effects and consequences and actions that led to this specific moment. And when we're talking in terms of a weird sense, saying something was meant to be isn't a way of saying, well, it was meant to be good or bad or whatever, but rather it was meant to be because X, Y, Z, Q things happened that led to this particular outcome and this particular space. So I kind of lean more towards the woven cloth because I think that there's room for things to change and to be altered. To L again, given that our actions have enduring consequences, are we constantly influencing Wyrd, whether subconsciously or unconsciously? Yes. And sometimes those influences can be very small and not apparent at the time, and they can blossom into a much bigger thing. Like, for example, this is one that comes to mind, and it's a thing because it's a thing I just recently learned and heard on a really brilliant podcast about this particular moment in British history called the Battle of Cable Street, where, very short version, the people who were living in the East End of London had to organize to stop the British Union of Fascists from marching through their neighborhood and making a mess of things and doing hate crimes and all the stuff that fascists like to do. But a thing I did not know about this story was the genesis of it was actually much earlier. When you go back 20 years before, in that part of London, there was a dock workers strike that was going on, and the predominantly Irish dock workers were out on strike, and they needed folks who could help take care of their kids while they were out on the picket line. So they turned to their Jewish neighbors in the East End. And in fact, it was like two specific, like, young Jewish women who started doing this from this tiny little seed of, hey, we'll take care of your kids while you're out of work, came something much bigger that no one in that moment could have predicted. So in a lot of ways, we're always influencing Wyrd, whether we know it or not, whether we mean to or not. And there is something always beautiful about thinking about these kind of moments in history of, oh, sometimes that little thing was the hinge on which world events turned. And also, sometimes that little thing is the thing that's the hinge on which the events of your life move as well. Let's see, moving to the next one. Kimmy, again, thank you. Is fire and ice an open or closed practice? It is an open practice. It is very much a modern practice that has been developed within like the last 10, 15 years or so, and more specifically codified within the book. And we do have a growing and developing community for folks who want to learn more. We offer classes that are available through the website onblackwings.com. But it is absolutely an open practice. And as I also say up front in the book, The Way of Fire and Ice, this is a practice that belongs to anyone that feels that it speaks to them and works for them. And I think let's do one last question. And this is one more from L, and then I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Are there any instances where beings, gods, heroes, regular people have influenced Wyrd that has already been created, designs that have already been woven and are perceived as the past? That's something that comes up all the time in the source material when you look. One of the best examples is the whole thing of Ragnarok, that Ragnarok is a thing that is going to happen, But there's also implications that because Odin gets the foreknowledge of it, and presumably most of the other gods do as well, because, somebody composed the saga and wrote the thing down, and I'm fairly sure all the different gods can see the stuff that happens in Midgard, to varying extents, and probably have at least heard about this thing called Ragnarok around the divine water cooler. But because he knows of this, there's implications that actions he takes in the lead up to Ragnarok are made specifically to ensure the green world that's foreseen after the great battle will come to pass. There's also, interestingly enough, instances as well of people that are like, I don't know what the weird is going to be of this situation, but I'm going to press on and do the thing anyway. Like, there's a great expression from the Skirnismal, which is one of the sagas in the Poetic Edda, that goes something like this: boldness is better than complaints may be. An hour, like, my life was laid to an destined hour, and I will go forth regardless, is sort of the gist of it. I don't have it in front of me, so I kind of mangled it, but that's a mentality that's there as well, of I may not know of what's going to come, but I'm going to press forward anyway and do the thing the best I can. So yeah, thank you again, everybody. It's great having you all on, and it's been great having this opportunity. The book is Spinning Wyrd. You can get it through Llewellyn, and I know that LlewellynCon is going to be putting up a nice little coupon code so that folks can get it for a reduced cost. Please absolutely go through Llewellyn and get it directly from the publisher. That's the best way to help out Llewellyn and to help out me and all of our other authors. Especially in a world where Amazon is just devouring the world of publishing. So, support your publisher. If that doesn't work for you, then hit up your local bookstore, ask them to order it in, whatever it is you can to not give Jeff Bezos money. So, thank you all again. It's been great having you all on and having this opportunity to share this all with you. So, happy solstice, everyone, and have a great day and a great con.